All right, lecture 13 looks at interpersonal communication in small group settings. So we have our image here and our quote that says, "We must remember that one determined person can make a significant difference, and that a small group of determined people can change the course of history." Now you can see that quote in either a positive or negative light. It just depends on your experiences. I'm sure many of you have been in small group settings where one determined person wrecked your group, and at the same time where a group might have one determined person that kept that group going, that was sort of the leader, or at least the Coltrane of that group. So you can see this in either a positive or positive or negative light. And I know many of you have had both positive and negative experiences with groups. I know me personally, I've had a few more negative experiences than positive, but that could be the fact that I'm a little bit controlling in making sure I have all of the details and wanting to kind of have my hands in everything. So partially it's my fault. But at the same time, I have had those legitimately bad experiences. However, I have had legitimately good experiences, especially when I got into grad school and I worked with some just top-notch people. Those were usually excellent experiences. So you can kind of go either way. But let's take a look at what we are evaluating today in the terms of small groups. So here we are addressing small groups. And they are developed really for a variety of reasons. However, in many small groups, you're going to find yourself set to a decision-making task. Now, the group is formed to come to an agreement on one thing or another. So you usually make these groups because you have some kind of task, some kind of decision to make. And whatever the decision may be, the group should be prepared to make the decision effectively. Now here is a great way to assess decision making, and you can really use this same process in a personal decision that you have to make as well as a small group. It kind of gives a strategy, it gives a process to how to come to the conclusion that you need to come to make the decision you need to make. And it's very useful if you find yourself dealing with a complicated problem. Now this decision making process is called, or is what we term, the reflective thinking method. Now below I've given you each step as well as an example of how you could approach that step. So again, we're looking at this from a small group perspective, but really you could look at it from a variety of perspectives. Your dual, if it's just you and another person discussing an issue, you could also look at it just you personally. Maybe you're trying to decide what school to go to for graduate school, if that's your route, or which job to take, or what degree to get, that kind of thing. Those are all parts of the decision-making process that could fit into this step-by-step reflective thinking method. So let's look at these steps. Step 1, define the problem. So what is the problem? You need to understand fully what the issue is here. Now there are times when the problem is really not what you think it is. For example, your car has been totaled in an accident, and you really need to purchase a new car immediately. You have certain requirements for your new vehicle and need to find the best option for you personally. Now, this is pretty self-explanatory. Obviously, the problem is I need a new car. And that's an easy definition. I need a new car. However, in a more relation-based decision-making process, or in a more complicated situation, you might find that the problem isn't as obvious. So defining the problem is the very first step, and you really have to think it through. Lay out all the emotions that you're feeling, all of the experiences that you've had, so that you can really make sure you understand what the true issue is. Step 2, analyzing the problem. You want to look at two categories here. You want to determine what are the drivers of the problem and what are the restraining forces of the problem. Now, drivers are things that are driving the problem forward. They are causing the problem to persist. Okay, so they're pushing the problem forward. Restraining forces kind of flip that around. They are things that are holding the solution back from being implemented. So drivers drive the problem forward. They're focused on pushing the problem forward, whereas restraining forces keep you from solving it. So they may be on completely different things. For example, going back to our simple idea of purchasing a car, We might say that the driver of that problem is that the accident you were in and the lack of transportation to your work and school are driving the problem of you needing to replace your car. So those things keep you having this problem. They're pushing the problem forward. They're continuing that drive of the problem. The restraining force of that same decision is that the lack of knowledge about what car you can afford and what is available might hold you back from making the decision. Maybe you're unsure, maybe you are in the midst of research. Those things are restraining you from making that decision. So let's look at the next step. So we've defined the problem, we've analyzed it for drivers and restraining forces. Now we're going to identify criteria for solving the problem. Now, unfortunately, many people skip this step, or they think they can just go with the flow on this step. And honestly, if you really, really want a solid solution and you've done the first two steps right, lay this out, write it down, verbalize these criteria. What are the most important things to consider in your solution? So if you could have it ideally, what would it look like? What are the things that are an absolute must in your situation? So in our example of the car purchase, we may have a variety of criteria. I'd really like to have a bright colored car, or I'd really like to have an SUV, not a sedan. Those things might be absolutely a must, and they might be kind of, well, it's not that big of a deal. I just purchased a new car not that long ago, and I had some very big criterias. One was the cost, obviously. Another was the mileage, obviously. Those are usually the two big ones. But my third one was that I needed to have either a van, a minivan, or a large SUV. I have 3 dogs, 2 children, and a construction worker husband. So I really needed to have a lot of space for us to travel or to haul things. So those were my criteria. For our criteria here, let's just say that we have a cost criteria, that it needs to be no less than $6,000. And I know that sounds weird, but maybe that is the kind of car that you want, but no more than $8,000. Okay, a lot of people say, well, my max is $8,000. And you may very well find this extraordinary deal of a $4,000 car that just meets every one of your criteria. And so you should never rule it out. But on average, you're looking between a certain range of numbers for a certain quality. Maybe your second one is that you have mileage no greater than 70,000 miles, and that you want, number 3, a large vehicle, some kind of large car. Those would be your criteria. So you would not even assess anything that does not fall into these 3. Maybe you really do want a bright colored car, but you wouldn't use that as one of your criteria because it's debatable. It's not that big of a deal whether or not you have a bright colored car. These are an absolute must. So you keep those only absolute must criteria. And that's step 3. Step 4, you generate solutions or alternatives. So you lay out as many solutions that you can come up with, as many as you can come up with. Even if the solution is really kind of unlikely and you want a better list of solutions, honestly, you really should lay them all out. You can delete them later, but lay them all out. Get yourself a nice, full, and comprehensive list. So let's say I've got a couple of things here. I want to purchase a used car. A potential solution is that I want to purchase a used car with all my criteria. It fits into all of these 3 things here above, maybe even more. Maybe I want to purchase a new car with more than the minimum criteria and take out a loan. Okay, so maybe I do want a new car, but obviously that's going to have more than just my 3. Maybe it's going to have the color I want. Maybe it has a couple features that I'm looking for, and I'll need to take out a loan. Or potential solution 3, purchase a car for under budget that does not fit all my criteria. So maybe you find a car that is $4,500, but it has 97,000 miles on it, or something along those lines. Okay? And the final one is, I'm going to leave it not even numbered, but it is really a solution if you think about it. It's to do not purchase a car and ride the bus everywhere or ride a bike. And some people actually take those routes. It just depends on the circumstance. I honestly don't think it's a bad idea depending upon your situation. For me personally, 3 dogs, 2 kids, a construction worker husband, not a possibility. So have to have a car. So these are just a few solutions. I obviously stick with the first 3, but anyone could go whichever route fits their life. And then step 5, which is kind of our final step, is to evaluate solutions or alternatives. So you go through each possible solution and match them up with your criteria. So whichever matches the most criteria should really be your first attempt at a solution. If you are absolutely at a must with certain parts of your criteria, they really need to fit all of them. And those 3 were things that I felt if I were to be doing this myself, I would absolutely have to fit into these criteria. Okay, so you're going to select, implement, and revisit the solutions. So the first solution fits all my criteria. Number 1, purchase a used car with all 3 criteria like we mentioned earlier. It fits all of my criteria, so I'm going to attempt that solution first. However, if that solution does not work because there are no cars available like the one I want to consider, solutions 2 or 3 may be an option. Alright, so now you see how the steps to decision making can really make a difference in a situation with a small group and even potentially just on your own. Now, interpersonal relationships in a group can be quite the challenge. Now, especially when we look at a group task and consider decision making. It's hard enough making collaborative decisions between 2 people, but it's even more complex when you involve a small group. So let's look at what this group had to go through to make a decision. Now, obviously this is not something that I could play for you here, but if you get a chance to go on YouTube or on the text-based version of this lecture and check out Abandoned Ship. It is an old movie, and I understand that many people don't like old movies. Really, my criteria for a good movie is really fantastic special effects. Well, old movies don't have that. However, this is a great, really thought-provoking movie. It's about an hour and a half long, so if you get a chance to watch it, I would highly recommend it. And there are a couple of spoilers that I'm mentioning here, so please be careful when you're looking at these. You don't want to be spoiled on the results of this show. So if you plan on watching this, stop this here and then go back and read the rest of this or listen to the rest of this later. All right. Okay, so hopefully you had a chance to watch the movie. So we saw through the film that decision making in small groups can be quite the challenge. Now, even though decision making is one of the main reasons why groups are formed, there are various purposes for creating a group. Now, these folks didn't have the choice. They were in the group without really making the decision to be in the group. And even the leader kind of was made the leader without really wanting to be the leader. And they had to make some very, very difficult decisions. It's very thought-provoking. What would you do if you found yourself having to make sure your group survives in this way? So regardless of how we get there, how we get to be in a group, it is important to understand the nature of a small group as well as some of the issues that they may deal with. Now, one of the first things to consider is what makes up a small group. Consider what small groups you've been associated with in the past. How would you describe those groups? What kind of made them a small group? Now, while each small group is different in its own way, there are a few things that are universal to all small groups. So these criteria are universal. It's no matter what small group you're in, these things define a small group. And this means that you cannot be considered a small group if your group does not meet these criteria. So here are some of the basic criteria for a small group. First, it has to have 3 or more people. A small group cannot consist of 2 people. That's a dyad. It's not a small group. This is usually fairly clear. However, where does the number max? How many can you have before you are no longer, quote, small? Now, the common number among scholars, so the common range that people see is a small group range, is anywhere from about 8 to 12 people. And 12 would really be the maximum that you would consider a small group. And it could be as low as 3, but 8 to 12 would be the max. Now, while this gives us a good idea of the average maximum size of a group, its number is not really concrete like many of the scholars suggest. One way to look at it is that if you can tell if an individual is missing from your group, then it's kind of a small group. So for example, if I'm in a class of 20 and John Smith is absent that day, I would likely notice, not guaranteed, but likely notice. He's very easily identifiable in my group. However, if I was in a same type of class, but it had 100 people in it, and John Smith was absent that day, I probably wouldn't notice that he was gone. So I wouldn't consider 100 people a small group. I mean, that's fairly obvious, but even 35 or 40, I'm not sure I would notice if John was gone. Maybe not even 20, it just depends on John's personality. But if you notice someone's missing, if you know that there's not someone present in your group, then you could probably consider it a small group. Second criteria for being a small group is shared perception. This is where reflecting back on our discussion about perception earlier in the term kind of helps. We recalled that perception is the active process of making sense of our environment. Now, when we consider group perception, so more than just you, we see ourselves as belonging to the group. So we understand that we are part of a larger whole and that our actions and inactions can and will affect others in a group. So without a shared perception, we can't really label ourselves as group members. So imagine if you've ever done a group project in a class. You obviously have your own personal identity and you share your own personal experiences and perceptions. But then you get into groups and you've got 4 or 5 groups in a classroom, maybe even more. Now you have identified with that group as compared to every other group in the class. And you as a group have these shared perceptions of the project, of each other, of the content that you're researching, and so on. So you have this shared perception. The next communication requirement for a small group is that you must be interdependent. Now, being interdependent means that those within the group depend on one another. So in order to be considered a small group, you must have some sort of interdependence. That interdependence can come in a variety of forms. It doesn't have to be one specific way. Now, we can depend on others to get a task done, or we can just do it to socialize. It just depends on the nature of the group. Now, regardless of the reason, we must be connected in some way. We must depend on each other in some way. If you are in a tennis club, well, you obviously depend on each other to play the game. You have to have someone other than yourself there to play a game. So you could depend on each other in that way. Maybe it's a decision-making group. Who knows? So for example, if I was in a group at school that was placed together for brainstorming purposes, but my group never really brainstormed, I'm sure you've been in that group before, and we didn't really rely on each other for grades, so let's say that grades were calculated individually, then there would be really no interdependence between us. I wouldn't rely on them for anything, and they would not really rely on me for anything. However, if that same group had to submit a paper to the instructor with brainstorming ideas that was compiled by the group, then there would be kind of a level of interdependence there. Okay, it would be a lower level, but it'd still be there. And then finally, the next requirement, let's recap, we had consists of 3 or more people, shared perception, and then interdependent. You also have to have some form of communication. And this day and age, that form of communication can come in a variety of methods. Whether our communication within the group is face-to-face, via a conference call, which I can't stand those, but if that's what you got, or maybe a webcam, or a social media chat, a Facebook message, whatever it is, or even just through email, we must communicate in some fashion. Our verbal and nonverbal signs, yes, there are nonverbals in digital communication. They kind of help to establish those norms and the behaviors within the group that are necessary for interdependence as well as shared perception. So small groups must understand their nature in order to function effectively, knowing how to communicate effectively, understanding your level of interdependence, and perceiving yourself as belonging to a group will help each group member to understand their group and their role within that group. So what role do you take in your groups? Are you an information gatherer, relational maintenance counselor? Oh, I've been that before. Or maybe even a leader? Depending upon the group task, your level of expertise on a topic, or even your personality, you may end up in a variety of roles. I have found myself in all three roles very, very easily. Just depends. One role that some fear and others crave is the role of leader. The leader in a group may take on a great deal of responsibility. Let's refer back to the video, to the movie we watched. They could take on a great deal of responsibility and monitor both the task and relational functions within the group. So you don't have just one requirement, you have multiple requirements. And an effective leader understands his or her position in the group. Now, my husband and I were talking about this the other day. When he was working as an electrician for a company, he led a group for a while before he went back to school, and he was saying that when he transitioned from being the leader to a part-time position so he could go back to school, it was just a huge relief, because as the leader, he had to deal with any disobedience, he had to deal when things didn't go well, and then as a follower or as a part-time employee, he could just do the job he was assigned and go home. So honestly, being the leader does take on a lot of responsibility. So what makes a good leader? Is really there a particular leadership style that we should all strive for? Actually, there are really a variety of leadership styles, and each has their benefits and drawbacks, and each is useful in a variety of situations. So below is an explanation of the two most common leadership styles that I thought I'd just throw out there real quick before we end today, and see what you think, if maybe you've either been this person or you have found yourself in a group with a leader that is one of these qualities. So the two most common are democratic and autocratic. And a democratic leader maintains that a more equal status in the group is necessary. It's like having a democracy. People can vote, people can participate, everyone has equal status. And they often use a very collective approach to that decision making. When is it good to be a democratic leader? When the group has time to deliberate and to hear all sides of an issue, this is the best choice. So if you've got the time to make decisions, to talk things through, then you want a democratic leader. And this leadership style promotes inclusion and participation within the decision-making process. Typically, it's a good route to take unless you are on a tight time scale, which the next one shows. The autocratic leader is someone that has a perception of the leader having more power than the followers, and they usually make the decisions themselves. Now, it is actually a good tool, tactic to use. Not always, obviously, but in some cases when a quick decision needs to be made and time doesn't really allow for a democratic approach, the autocratic leader is not a bad leader. You kind of want to be in that boat. Now, there is a third that some people talk about. They call them laissez-faire. They basically are non-existent. They lay back and let the group do their own thing. So they're kind of just a figurehead. They don't really have their hands on the material or on the decision-making process. So I didn't add them there because I really don't even see them as leaders. But it is a style. So with the democratic and autocratic, there are times to use them. And if you're thinking this question in your head, wait, can you be both democratic and autocratic? Absolutely. I have been both democratic leader and autocratic leader in the same group. It just depended on the circumstance. So really you can be both. Most of the time you're one or the other, but you can be both. So as you can see, no leadership style is the right choice for every situation. And consider the nature of your group and the task, and really also the relational needs that come with it, and choose what works for that situation. Small groups can be a blessing and a hindrance. If the members of the groups are willing to understand and abide by the roles and the norms agreed upon by the group, and have a general understanding of the makeup of their group, then there's a good chance that that particular group will succeed. I wish you the best of luck in your groups, and we will see you for the next lecture.